حي على الفلاح.
Now, after we spoke about the different aspects of the Khilaf of Uthman, the second half of the Khilaf of Uthman was a time in which the trial and tribulation, the turmoil began slowly to pop its head up amongst the different lands of the Muslimin, and a great plan was put to take down Uthman radiallahu anhu. That the period of Uthman radiallahu anhu, his Khilafah was how many years? Between 12 and 13 years. Half of those years was beautiful. The next half, or the second half of those years, began the fitan, planning for the downfall of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And as you can see, it wasn't something that happened overnight, but the implementation or the implementing of the plan took 6 years. The Muslimin at the time were the most powerful force on earth. Through their aqeedah, through their belief, through their arms, through their army, they were advanced in every aspect. So it took for them 6 years of plotting and planning, and they were able to reach to the middle of the house of the Khalifa. What was the cause? What was the reasons for those who plotted and planned against the Khalifa, that they were able to implement their plan? You have a side that is planning, and you have a side that is opposing that plan. That side that is planning, no matter how much it plans, if this side is firm in its belief, firm in its aqeedah, firm in its position, firm in its following of Islam, implementing the deen, no matter how much this side plots and plans, it will never affect. Why? They plan, they plot, and Allah plans and plots, not like they're planning and plotting. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثِلِ الْأَعْلَى. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has placed a plan for them. So when the ummah is following the orders of Allah, and when the ummah is straight upon the path, no matter how much they plot and plan, they will never be able to affect the ummah. So here we want to understand the cause and the reason for the fitna during the time of Uthman, because this opens the door to a very important time and era within the Islamic history. Now, the majority of the scholars, or a large number of the Salaf, the righteous predecessors, they were of the opinion of not to go into these topics. We believe in the righteousness of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. We believe that they were of people of ijtihad. They had their personal reasoning, that they will both be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's sufficient enough, and we close our mouths except with that which is good towards them. But unfortunately, because going into details, many people might misunderstand. Many people might not have a complete understanding of what happened, of what took place. So you're opening a door for people to misunderstand certain things. But unfortunately, in our time now, this is the Salaf talking. Because of the mass production of matters against Islam, against that era, against that time, against the Sahaba, the full attack, it is going on. So that's why it is very important for us to clear the matter and to make sure that we understand the matter in the best of ways, and to understand the matter in how it was done and how it took place, so that we are able to take care and we are able to truly defend the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And we are able to defend those people who were the holders and the bearers of this deen. And then also another reason is that there have come around many people who have authored books on this topic and have made great mistakes. For there are 3 categories of people who had authored books on this topic. One of those from the contemporary writers who deal with the turmoil with the Sahaba, and they are a product of the Western way of thinking. By natural means, has a hostile approach towards the Islamic history. And it is unfortunate that you even hear Muslimin today, they speak the same about the Islamic history or the history of Islam. So they started criticizing the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the Tabi'een in a way that it served their goals, as if they were people who were untrustworthy just for the sake of obtaining this dunya. There were people who lacked belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and accusations against the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, against people like Muawiyah, against people like Talha and Zubayr, against people like Aisha radiallahu anha al-Mu'mineen. A full-blown attack against these people. The people say, why do you mention this? Why do you speak about this? Why? Because you find people, unfortunately, who claim to be from Ahlul Sunnah who are following these thoughts. One man, he comes up to me, says, I can't find it in my heart after I say the name Muawiyah to say radiallahu anhu. It's not up to you whether you say radiallahu anhu or not. I can't find it in my heart. Why? Because of what happened between him and Ali radiallahu anhu. Because of the fitna that took place. And where does this come from? It doesn't come from Ahlul Sunnah. It doesn't come from our teachings. It comes from external causes. Every generation that comes, the external plotting and planning is always going to be there. They're always going to plot, they're always going to plan. But it is accordance with our position, our strength, our power, is if that plotting and planning it works or not. So the first category are those who gave a bad image of that time and condemned the Sahaba, criticized the Sahaba. And then you have authors, contemporary authors, who also wrote about and authored books on that time and on that trial and tribulation, but they unfortunately adopted a lot of views that were dependent upon weak narrations due to their lack of ability to differentiate between that which is authentic and that which is weak. Now, one of the known matters in the Islamic history books is that the historians, they narrated and they put in their books everything that they could grab hold of. Authentic, weak, fabricated, everything. But everything that they placed in their books, they placed it with a chain of narration. They are thinking on their level, on their time, on their era. So a man comes and takes the book of, for instance, Imam al-Tabari, one of the famous books, most famous books and oldest books of Islamic history, Tarikh al-Tabari. And in that book of history, he mentions everything that he has ever heard. But he mentions it with a chain of narrators. Now when you have a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, usually what we see, what the people, the general people, they see is narrated on the authority of Abu Hurairah from the Prophet ﷺ that he said kada kada kada. And the beginning of that hadith or the chain of narration is cut off. Because to the general person, whether it's there or it's not, that's not going to change his benefit from it. But if you go back to, and then at the end of it, it will say, it was narrated by Bukhari. If you go back to that hadith and you look for it in Sahih al-Bukhari, you'll find it, and before Imam or before Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, there's about 5 or 6 narrators that go back to Imam al-Bukhari. Then Imam al-Bukhari, he narrates it of his teacher, he of his teacher, he of his teacher, to the companions, to the Prophet ﷺ. This is what we call a chain of narrators. Everything is connected, everything is narrated, goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, not to John or Paul or anyone else. Everything goes back to قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And that path in which it reached the Prophet ﷺ, we know it, man by man, narrator by narrator. And this goes back to, as we mentioned before, the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to what? To preserve this deen, to preserve the revelation of this deen. And the different narrations, the hadith falls under that. So the second type of books that were authored are books that were written with a good intention, but unfortunately were not able to differentiate between that which is authentic and that which is not authentic. And when it comes to history, you will find that there are narrations that have been placed that are completely false and completely fabricated against the Sahaba. And these narrations have been placed intentionally to get the people to think ill about the Sahaba, or to have a doubt around the Sahaba. And the majority of these narrations were placed and fabricated by the Rawafid. If you look at their books, they are full of these. Narrations against Abu Bakr, narrations against Umar, narrations against Uthman, narrations against Aisha radiyallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen, narrations against Talha, narrations against Az-Zubayr, narrations against Muawiyah, narrations against all the Sahaba, and narrations all for Ali radiyallahu anhu. In our books, in the books of Ahlul Sunnah, we have in Sahih Bukhari, masalan, and Sahih Muslim, you have what is called Kitab al-Fada'il, the book of virtues. In their books you have Kitab al-Radha'il, the book of bad things that they did, the book of how they attacked Ahlul Bayt, the book of how they defamed Ahlul Bayt, the book of how they took from Ahlul Bayt. In our books we only mention the virtues, because that which the person does as a sin is between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That which the person does, none of us have ever claimed and will ever claim that any of the companions were infallible. They did sin. The famous story of the man that used to drink alcohol. On 3 different occasions he was caught, or he came and put himself forward because he drank alcohol. So one of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu, when he was brought forward again, he cursed him. For Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he reprimanded him. He said, don't say ill about him, for all I know is that he loves Allah and he loves his Prophet. So none of us said that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum were infallible. The third category of authors are those who brought these narrations forward and criticized them in accordance with the science of al-jarh wa ta'deel, and tried to their best ability to interpret the events in a way that befits the status of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And one of the main books that were written on this topic, that unfortunately to my knowledge hasn't been translated into English, is Al-Awasim min Al-Qawasim lil-Imam Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi. Not the one from Portugal. Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki rahimahullah ta'ala al-Andalusi, one of the main scholars of the Maliki madhab. He has a book that he authored called Al-Awasim min Al-Qawasim, and the book deals with that topic, and it's very summarized to the extent that there needs a lot of work that is done. So one of the later scholars, Muhibbuddin al-Khatib, he authored, or he did a commentary on it, and that commentary is even more beautiful than the original book itself. But this is one of the main books that studied this era and interpreted it in a way that befits the status of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with them. And this is what is important with regards to the different authors that authored and that wrote about these books, because it's very important, my dear brothers and sisters in Islam, that not every book that you go and buy, purchase, not every article that you read, not every little hashtag that you see, not every little post that you see on Facebook or here or there, not everything that you see is true. Not everything that you read is true. Not the interpretation that you have sometimes is correct. That's where, unfortunately, one of the main causes for those who involved themselves in the fitna, in the trial, in the turmoil, were those who lacked understanding, easily taken in by the different matters that they tried to accuse Uthman radiallahu anhu with. Uthman, he does this, he does that, look what he did this. So they'll join with them in their cause. So lack of understanding of the deen. Because it is unfortunate that you always have someone that comes, Shaykh, but I read this. Where did you read it? I saw it on Facebook. Facebook has become a resource for Islamic sciences. Or I heard it on YouTube. Who's the person? A brother, he's well known. They have become a resource for Islamic understanding. And this is where, unfortunately, in our time, in our era, and that's why it's important for us to read and to learn about these things from the authentic and from the trustworthy sources, because everything is out there. And it's unfortunately that the majority of those who are given fame, given the spotlight, given the position, are people who don't have a background in Islamic studies. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward every single person who is trying to benefit the Muslimin. But there's a big difference between a scholar, a alim, a resource, a person that you go to for matters of the deen, and between a person who is a da'i, between a person who is a normal shaykh. That's why you need to be careful where you read from, where you hear from, especially in matters that are from the principles of the deen, from the principles of the aqeedah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ability that some people have when it comes to the matters of the deen is surprising. How much they talk with no knowledge. It's also important for us, as we said, to study the fitna of Uthman and its consequences in order to know the real causes and whether they were internal or they were external, and the effect that they had upon the ummah. So that's why we need to look upon them and study them and understand what these causes, what these reasons were. Now the Prophet ﷺ, he informed us of the fitan and the trials and tribulations that would come, and he warned us against them. And he warned first and foremost the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. He wanted the Sahaba to be prepared. And if you look into the seerah of the Sahaba who were around at that time, the major Sahaba, some of them who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed for them not to be directly involved, they stood away and they took their hands out of the fitna to save and to preserve themselves. Also, the hadith that are mentioned by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they contain hints about who would stir up this turmoil, where it would come from, who would be the ones who would begin this turmoil, and that they would be people who appeared to be what? To be believers and be very strict in their religious commitment. That's why when the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentioned the Khawarij, he mentioned about them their salat, the recitation of the Quran, their worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you will feel disgraced in front of their worship. But they will leave the deen as fast as the arrow leaves the bow. When Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, if I am around when they come, I will fight them myself. Why? Because they will cause a great turmoil for the Muslimin. And that fitna will be caused through their different or through the corrupt interpretation of the deen. Also, the turmoil will expose the hypocrites and cleanse the hearts of the believers and increase them in faith. Because the Muslimin, whenever a fitna befalls the Muslimin, unlike any other ummah, any other nation, the fitna brings the Muslimin closer together. Also, the reports that are mentioned upon the Prophet ﷺ carry an explicit warning against falling into it or playing any part in it. Because when the believers of this ummah, the Sahaba and those generations that came after them, heard the Prophet ﷺ foretelling that some of them would be involved in this and some would be attached to this world and so on, this stirred in their hearts the feeling of what? Of wanting to confront this fitna. And each one of them would hope to be saved from it and would prepare themselves to be saved from it. So what are the reasons for the turmoil that led and to take his life in the middle of his own house?